Content warning. This episode contains discussion of murder.
When we think about assassinations of American presidents, we tend to think of quick and sudden events. The killer pulls the trigger of his weapon, and the lives of men like Abraham Lincoln or John F. Kennedy get snuffed out. But it doesn't always happen like that. And that's certainly not how it occurred for President James Garfield.
He was shot over 140 years ago, but the times he lived in were full of the same sort of political unrest we see today. And, though no one could have predicted it, his suffering and death helped to bring the country together. The attempts to save him also spurred scientific advancements and inventions that we still use today. The air conditioner, for instance, was originally developed in an effort to help make the wounded president more comfortable.
To get the full story, we turn to C.W. Goodyear. He's just released a terrific new book, President Garfield, From Radical to Unifier. This biography does an amazing job making Garfield and the people he knew seem alive and vibrant. We highly recommend it. And of course, his book ends with the story we are telling today, the story of the death of a president.
My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
And this is The Murdersheet.
We're a true crime podcast focused on original reporting, interviews, and deep dives into murder cases.
We're The Murdersheet.
And this is The Assassination of President James Garfield, a conversation with C.W. Goodyear.
Feel like we owe you an apology, given the focus of your book is this intricate portrait of James Garfield's life.
And in the book, you say that his death tends to overshadow his life, and then here we just want to talk to you about his death. So
no, that's all right. That's the singularity that really that a lot of the book is moving towards. You know, with historical writing, sometimes you encounter opportunities to break the fourth wall. And his death was honestly something that he almost seemed to foresee in many ways. Or at least he had these premonitions of doom that were impacting him in the run-up to his run for the presidency, because he wasn't running. And the way he was kind of, almost against his will, catapulted to the front of the ticket. And so that's kind of an interesting thing we can also pick apart down the line.
Absolutely. And we're going to kind of start off by sort of talking about Garfield, move into the events leading up to his assassination, and then the impact and, of course, his legacy afterwards. But to start off with, we'd love to know a bit more about you and how you sort of came to write this book on James Garfield.
Oh, sure. Well, let's see. 5 years ago, I was working in DC as a co-author and a ghostwriter. I was writing books for and with other people. And I think because of where geographically I was in the country, and then also where we all were, and to a certain extent still are, I was interested in finding a period of American history where the conditions were not exactly like our own today, but they were somewhat comparable in terms of the theme of division being the order of the day. And I wanted to find a national figure who was leading the country in a way that was defying that divisive spirit. Somebody who was trying, at great cost, honestly, to keep our machines of government functioning against the division of the day. And so I was drawn to Reconstruction in the Gilded Age, which was the post-Civil War and then the post-Civil War. And I found the same person floating in the background of most every major event of that time, and that was James Garfield. And the closer I got to the way he was written about, then. The way he was presented in most of the historical record, it was future president would be killed within his first year in office. And the closer I got to him, the less fair that seemed as a historical record. So I came across what I thought to be, and now and still think to be, one of the most impressive political rises to power in American history. And so that's what drew me to him.
I was really impressed with how you bring him alive and you tell the story of the whole man. You talked about his relationship with his wife and some of the issues there. You even talk about his problematic history with Native Americans. And at one point, you almost like step out from behind the page and say, you guys should go read more about this from my Native American sources. So
yeah, that seemed like the right way to do it. He was, more than any other person of that time, a very good reflection of the complexities of that era. He was somebody who was part of the radical revolution, so he was incredibly progressive on certain racial rights for that time. He was more progressive than Lincoln as a radical Republican, and he even joined the Union Army during the Civil War because he wanted to be part of this liberating force in the South. But then he also, I think, almost alone bears the weight of also being present for the regression of that time. He was present both in the formation of Reconstruction and then in its dismantling towards the end of it. He began his congressional career as one of the great firebrands of the Congress of that period. And then by the end, he is this person who's willing to defer progress to the next generation of Americans. He has this optimism about what he calls the destiny of the Republic. But he's also saying that only wisdom and justice over the course of time can bring about that more righteous America. And so it's an interesting, he's a wonderful blend of characters. You're right. He was very progressive for some races, and then for Native Americans, he believed in their capability. He believed in the quality of the races. So on that end, sure, that's a forward-looking viewpoint. And then on the other end, he also thought that in order for Native Americans to achieve that equality, they needed to be forcibly integrated into our version of American society. And so that's like taking a progressive worldview and then being very regressive with it. He was in favor of clean government reform, but he was also not afraid of using his political power to give public jobs to his allies, to his friends. And he was also this preacher. He was an abolitionist preacher, and he had this sterling public image, especially by the time he was shot. But he also had, a difficult, as you mentioned, relationship with his wife, and he cheated on her even at one point. So he's a wonderful encapsulation, not just of the complexity of that time, I think, but also of just the way American politics works and the people it often turns upon at unique moments. So, but I appreciate that you like that presentation. I think he, and also the time, there's just so much color there that can sometimes get lost when you're trying to retell that story for a modern audience. If there's ever a moment to dive into like those neglected nooks of American history, especially the Gilded Age, it might be now.
Yeah, one thing the book does extraordinarily well, in my view, is it brings out a lot of the color that's been neglected. And one way you do that is Garfield seems to have been a pretty good writer and a pretty good observer. One thing that sticks out in my mind, there is an account of a dinner he has with President Grant, where Grant says, "I don't like dogs. Do you think dogs could become insane?"
Yeah, I was just telling somebody about that the other day because they were asking me about the relationship between Grant and Garfield, and I thought that was a very cutting line from Garfield, who goes home in his diary and he reports these insane observations, and he goes, revealed some interesting things about the president's character. And like, just what an eccentric. Yeah, the characters of that period were so rich, and that extends to these other figures like Roscoe Conkling, James Blaine. Garfield was a very good writer and a very knowledgeable one. He was incredibly widely read. He might have been the most intellectual person to ever be president. He was a Supreme Court attorney while also being in Congress. He wrote a proof of the Pythagorean theorem. He wrote these great columns in the Atlantic, but he was also this great diarist, and he knew how important the time that he was experiencing was. He had this depth of mind and understanding of legislation that he could balance studies of serious public policy with like how to tell them in a compelling way. And you might have also noticed this. He opened every day of his diary, or most every day of his diary, for the year of 1878 with a different Shakespearean verse. And when you have an American politician who not just knows Shakespeare, but who can apply it to their day-to-day lives, that's when you know you're dealing with a pretty brilliant mind. So it was great. And it was surprising how many, for somebody who had such a pleasant public image, he could be very cutting.
Yeah, that dog thing was absolute. I'm like, if he leaked that to the press nowadays, that would very destructive. You touched upon this, but and it kind of it's such a broad question, and he was present at such a time of like real kind of chaos and change, and at some point, regression essentially. But how would you encapsulate the political climate into which he kind of started his political career and his rise to effectively the top?
Yeah, he rose during a period of division as well. And the reason he ended up distinguishing himself later on is because as the parties of that time, specifically the Republican Party, became more fractured, Garfield was this unifying figure. At the beginning of his career, he was rising to become a state level politician in Ohio in antebellum, so before the Civil War, and the country was pretty inexorably moving towards a schism, an existential schism on the subject of slavery. And in this context, Garfield, he's in his late 20s. He's the president of a local college. He's an abolitionist preacher, and he's a state senator. He identifies very much on the progressive side of American politics. He identifies very strongly as a radical. And I think distinctively as a young, ambitious, and hyper-partisan person of the time in these divisions that antebellum America was experiencing, Garfield actually saw a great opportunity. And he saw opportunity both for the type of politics he embodied. He wrote of the Civil War, interestingly enough, as being divine will. He thought that it was divine punishment, really, on America for not living up to its professed founding values in the way it structured society. But he also saw opportunity for himself. He thought that by joining the war and fighting it, he thought that he could win prominence on a national level by being this ardent warrior of the times, and not only like a literal warrior, but also a political one. So he wanted to distinguish himself by his partisanship at the beginning of his career, which again is a dramatically different position that he ended up being remembered for 2 decades later when it's time for him to become president.
And then in terms of, the time around his assassination, how had things shifted at that point into this Gilded Age, Reconstruction? There's so much that has changed. And how did that, one thing that kind of is a very prominent part of the book is, the civil service reform and
Yes.
what he stood for. And of course, unfortunately, that ended up having a role in his assassination. So, what were sort of the hot button issues that were still swirling around once he's kind of, reached the top, is in the White House at this point?
Yeah, he had so over the course of Reconstruction, which took about a decade to run its course from 1865 to about 1876, you had Northern voters getting tired of worrying about racial issues in the South. So the tide had gone out on that style of politics in the aftermath of the Civil War. There had been a lot of infighting as well between within the coalition that won that war. You had the radical Republicans fight with moderate Republicans, and then they together fought against President Andrew Johnson. And over the decade, you had voters getting less interested in the South. You had legal challenges to Reconstruction crop up, but you also had, definingly, as you point out, the issue of civil service reform. Now, I know that sounds like a subject that is designed to put you to sleep, but it's actually one of the most fascinating and, dare I say, sexy and compelling bits of public policy of this period in American history. Today, Americans think of the public bureaucracy is like a professional, very tightly regulated series of stovepipes and bureaucrats and professional civil servants who, manage in a very tightly controlled way just the business of the country. Back in Garfield's time, and especially after the Civil War, the American civil service was pretty thoroughly disorganized. There was no regulation of requirements for what it takes for somebody to have a post in the federal bureaucracy, rather than have professional standards and competitive applications for government jobs and for controls over how public officials could draw their salaries and how they could monetize their office. You instead had a purely politicized process. So almost every single federal sheriff, post office worker, tax collector, they owed their jobs not to really a department of the government. Instead, they were products of the patronage system, where their jobs had been arranged by their congressman or their senator. So what you had was, because after the Civil War, the federal government had emerged from the war as the biggest employer in the country. And so you had all of these jobs that were up for grabs and that you had to earn basically through political service to your local party chief or whatever. And that created this incredibly corrupt system of the awarding of public business. It was called the spoil system. So today, we hear the phrase, "To the victor go the spoils." That's a phrase from this period of American history. And it was used to refer to the idea that the president, whichever party won power in Washington, would then turn around and distribute public jobs to their cronies. And they would use that to basically monetize, their political office and create what were called machines. This was the growth of machine politics in American history. So you could see how that became a major source of public concern. When you have court clerks in American immigration courts who are personally like pocketing fees when you have people coming in and like pressing a lawsuit, when you have the customs collectors of New York who are also personally taking like a cut of whatever taxes and fees they're imposing on imports, you start to it breeds corruption. And so you had all of these machines popping up on both sides of the partisan aisle. You had Republicans and Democrats both doing this. And so the major upstart grassroots political movement of that time, it was not as much for these other issues like civil rights in the South and things like that. It was for clean government, for reform, for the institution of like norms and rules and regulations on public service, civil servants in America. And this created a huge problem in the Republican Party, because you had, rather than partisan division between the parties, you had division almost as much, and perhaps even stronger, within the parties on whether to actually reform the civil service, whether to break up the machines. You had one faction in the Republican Party by Garfield's presidency. They were called the Stalwarts. And they were the Stalwarts because they considered themselves unrepentant Republicans who believed that machines were necessary to hold power and to use power. You also had the Half-Breeds, which were another faction that were very colorfully named. And they were called that because they were seen as not being real Republicans by the Stalwarts, but they were also fairly corrupt. And then you had civil service reformists who just wanted to get rid of these corrupt power structures that were being abused by senators in Washington. And Garfield was elected president because he was the last person who fit between these factions, who was not thinking about factional politics, but who was instead trying to keep his Republican Party together. He was the most popular person in Washington personally because everybody liked him. He came to their table not with an axe to grind. He defined his politics by what he could accommodate from the other side, if that made any sense. So he became unwillingly thrown to the front of the ticket. He got nominated, it seemed, against his will on the floor of the Republican convention in 1880. And he immediately was afraid of how to balance these different factions. How do you keep clean government activists in your camp as well as this stalwart corrupt faction of the party? And that was the real main issue. And that ended up being something he was terribly afraid of managing. He had these nightmares about his presidency ahead of time. And he had all these threats coming in, honestly, written threats from stalwarts, from half-breeds, on how he needed to divide up the spoils once he took office. And he ended up having good reason to be so afraid of managing the situation because it led to his assassination.
Let's talk about that. One of the people who thought maybe they deserved a job or a post in the government, of course, was Charles Gitto. Can you tell us about him and his background?
Yes, Charles Gitto was a miserable human being. And he was somebody who had been, as I put in the book, he had been dealt a tough hand in how he had been born. And then he proceeded to play it very poorly. He emerged from a religious community, I believe, in upstate New York, the Oneida community. And he was essentially kicked out, from what I understand. And he ended up bouncing around, being this itinerant person who tried to distinguish himself in publishing, in preaching, in politics. He ended up getting married at some point, but he treated this woman awfully. But he had decided by the election of 1880 that if he did enough service on the campaign trail to the Republican candidate, whoever that would be, he would then be rewarded with one of these patronage jobs. So he gave a series of disjointed, terrible speeches that he would then try to use to claim for partisan service. He ended up meeting a series of Republican politicians at the time. He met Garfield's vice president, Chester Arthur. He met President Grant, and he tried to give them copies of his speeches. He says, look, I'm this Republican who's doing noble work. Remember me when you guys get into office and all this stuff. And the election comes around, Garfield wins, and Gitto, like literally thousands, maybe tens of thousands of other Americans at that time, see Garfield's victory as an opportunity to get a government job. So he goes to Washington and he starts appearing in these cabinet secretaries' offices, and he starts appearing with these clerks, and he starts saying, again, like all these other crowds, look, I did service on the campaign trail. Give me some job in the government. I would prefer to be ambassador to Vienna, if at all possible, which shows you where his mindset was. He was not a mentally stable human being, not in the slightest. And he distinguished himself out of all these crowds who were baying for jobs as somebody who was particularly worrisome. He even stalks the first lady. He shakes hands with Lucretia Garfield at some event, and he says, I elected your husband, and I expect to be made presidents, made some high-flying figure soon. But this is actually a very important point because he ruined something for all of us, Gitto. And the norms of American government at that time, even after the Lincoln assassination, it was seen as very important that our leaders, our political leaders, from the president to senators to congressmen, should be accessible to the public, should be approachable to regular citizens. They should be able to interact freely with crowds. They should be able to go do their own errands. That was seen as being very important for their ability to interact with the crowds. Gitto, with what he eventually did, changed all of that, because it was seen, he illustrated the dangers that lurk in certain corners of our society. I should also mention, I tried to avoid mentioning him by name at all in the book. I tried very hard to avoid identifying him because he achieved something that I think he was partially shooting for by doing this terrible thing that we're probably about to talk about. He ended up making a name for himself, which was something that he had really been shooting to do for a long time. And he savored it. He savored it right up until his execution of being somebody who had at last, after this difficult life, won some sort of fame for himself. And so I tried to fight that with the publisher. They said, you got to name him at least once. So I named him once. And that was at the very end. And then I add, after I mentioned his name, perhaps it would be better if none of us mentioned his name at all. And then I went on. So I had to settle for a half victory or maybe a total loss because my initial objective was not met as an author.
Well, I think it's a wonderful approach because, as you said, there's a school of thought when you're naming murderers, killers, people who are predators and doing horrible things. You're kind of helping them eclipse their victims at some point, and that's not acceptable.
Yes, you guys probably have to wrestle with that quite a lot, I imagine.
Yeah, it's a hard balance to strike given our focus, but I think given the fact that your focus was very much President Garfield, I think you did a really good job of talking about that issue.
Oh yeah, I appreciate it.
Yeah. I had one question, harkening back, because I'm sure this is a question on people's minds when they're hearing this. Lincoln is assassinated in 1865. Why on earth does that not prompt more change. And also, especially given some of the political violence that went on during Reconstruction, how do people separate that from, okay, we need to protect the president going forward?
I think it was national, almost adolescent naivete. So Lincoln's assassination was exceptional. It was the first that had that successful assassination of a president. Somebody had tried to shoot Andrew Jackson, but it had happened critically in wartime. And people of the time, and I think still to this day, ascribe his assassination as being just a product of the most destructive war in American history. So after his death, and after the national mourning that occurred after his death, people assumed that it was this one-off, that it was not something that would be repeated. So that was what was, so there was that element of it. And there was, yes, quite a lot of violence in the South that was occurring during this period. It was distant, though, and it was crucially, I want to say, it was targeted against Black Americans. It was something that was as far from men of Garfield's echelon as could be imagined. He read, and he was very compassionate towards the way Reconstruction was failing and how that was resulting in literal, bloody violence against Black Americans. But he was separated from it. There was this passive segregation almost from the leaders, the predominantly white male leaders of Washington, and then what was going on in certain corners of the country, let alone what was happening to Native Americans still. So there was that element to it as well. And to make it a little bit personal, Garfield himself, no one imagined that of any political figure to have a grudge that would result in assassination. No one expected that to be of James Garfield. He was described as being the most personally friendly and popular presence in Washington at that time. That was why he was elected. He was the last person who everybody could stand to be in a room with. And to add another detail, maybe building on the last question, actually, Gitto actually picked his gun, an ivory-handled revolver, because he specifically thought it would look good in a museum display. So he knew what he was shooting for. No pun intended.
You talked about what we've lost. We've lost the accessibility to our leaders. And of course, it was no secret what Garfield was going to be doing there. He's going to be heading out of town. Can you tell us about the events of July 2nd, 1881?
Yes, of course. So what had happened in his administration, this is a bit of a background detail, but he had eventually gotten into a fight over the patronage with Stalwarts. Stalwarts had not been happy with the share of jobs allocated them, and they were willing to go to war over it. And they had a big, fierce partisan fight with Garfield. Garfield won. And so that was the context of this happening. The assassin had been wandering about town, unable to get a job. He identified himself as a stalwart, and so he saw in the war or the way that Garfield had defeated the Stalwarts, he saw a conspiracy against his kind of Republican. And he decided eventually that if he shot Garfield, then the person who would take over, Vice President Chester Arthur, who was a stalwart, would be so grateful that Arthur would bestow on the assassin any job in the federal government that the assassin wanted. And so then you have these scenes throughout this period, late June, early July, where this person is literally following the president around town. If Garfield had looked out of his church window during one Sunday service, he would have seen a pistol being pointed at his head by this guy. He was walking down the street near the White House, near Lafayette Square, with Secretary of State James Blaine. They were arm in arm. If they had looked behind them, they would have seen this person following them, and it was the assassin. But eventually, yes, on the morning of July, or as I should say, on the evening of July 1st, the papers were reporting around Washington that the president was going to be catching a train from the Baltimore and Potomac station in downtown Washington to Massachusetts for his college reunion. And so the assassin saw that and said, perfect, I know exactly what I'm going to do. And he decided he was going to shoot him in the train station the next day. So Garfield wakes up. He does these morning routines with his son and his sons, and he decides then that they're going to escort him to the Baltimore and Potomac train station. So he goes with his sons and the Secretary of State, and they take a carriage together down to the Baltimore and Potomac railway station. They walk through the doors. They walk through the women's waiting room, and he takes a few steps inside, and then this assassin comes out behind and fires two shots. The first shot wings Garfield in the arm, and then the second hits him square in the lower back. And then he takes off running. So Blaine, Secretary of State Blaine, is arm in arm with the president. He sees the president collapse, and then Blaine runs after the assassin. And then he hears that he's been caught, turns around, and he sees Garfield collapsing into a pool of blood. Also in the station, Secretary of War, Robert Todd Lincoln. And Robert Todd Lincoln was the last surviving son of Abraham Lincoln, and he had been picked for Secretary of War because Garfield, again, was trying to wrap the Republican Party back together. The symbolism of having a Lincoln in the cabinet was very important. But as part of his duties as Secretary of War, Robert Todd Lincoln he's now witnessed an assassination. He has to secure the train station with troops. So he summons troops, he secures the area, and then he goes outside and he gives this quote to a journalist, and he asks how many hours of suffering I have seen in this town, which is just a wonderfully sad and powerful quote. And so then Garfield is, by all appearances, he's dying, it seems, on the floor of the railway station. Doctors are coming in, they're being summoned from around town, and they're coming in and they're sticking their fingers trying to find the path of the bullet in Garfield's back. Because at that time, the idea was, finding out where the bullet had gone, it was in his body somewhere, would be crucial to not only figuring out if he was going to live, but how any treatment would follow. There has been a lot of scholarship on when this happened, but at some point in this whole process, Garfield develops an infection. Some bacteria is introduced into the wound. So even as he stabilizes there in the train station, even as he starts to, keep himself together, the seeds have been sown for his death, because there's this toxin basically that's now going to start brewing in his body. And crucially, American doctors of the time weren't quite converts to the idea of germ theory. They still believed, or at least they had a foot in the idea, that illnesses in the body, and specifically infections as well, were the product of these humoral imbalances, like the composition of fluids and their almost hydraulic system of balance in the body. So there was an alternative idea coming out of Europe that maybe infections were actually not being caused by internal issues, but by external organisms that were somehow getting into the body and causing infections. But American doctors were hesitant. And there's this great quote that I have in the book from an American doctor, and it's talking about this idea coming out of Europe. And it goes, if we're to believe Mr. Lister's ideas of germ theory, not even calling this person a doctor, then we must believe that our entire world is coated in invisible, organisms that are causing these illnesses. And as a modern reader, you're like, yes, that's exactly what's happening. So anyway, but that's not clear at the moment. And so Garfield gets hauled out on a mattress, put in a carriage, and rushed back to the White House, where his torture really begins.
Can you tell us about that? What was this torture? What did this poor man have to endure for the next couple of months?
Yes. So the immediate question that the nation is faced with is he going to live? And for a few days, it looks as though that's not going to be the case. Bad internal bleeding, low pulse with Garfield. And so the country is initially worried, but then it turns into relief, because he turns around. You have this amazing just moment of not peace, but reconciliation across the country, where suddenly the favorite national pastime becomes monitoring the health of the president and whether he's going to live. These giant bulletin boards get erected in major squares in tiny town, 2-road crossings throughout the nation, that are sending updates, or that they display updates that are sent directly from the president's sick room in the White House. With his teams of doctors who have been assembled from across the military, academia, private practice. The binding public health issue, and really public notice of the day, is, will the president survive? And so initially, as he gets over the initial shock of being shot, the progress looks good. But then over the course of these weeks and months, this mysterious infection just spreads throughout his body. His bullet wound begins to hollow out. What's initially a small opening becomes almost cavernous inside. The doctors are caught between science and pseudoscience. They're trying to clean the wound, but they're also sending these probes deep into the body, trying to find the path of the bullet. They see pus start to erupt, but they see, again, per this pseudoscientific traditional system of medicine, they see the pus as being a good sign. So all these updates that they're sending around the country, they start to display like the texture and the volume of the pus coming out of the president in like good terms. They say, a dram of, yellowish fluid, good sign of healing, all that stuff. But this quote unquote recovery period starts to become very hard for the doctors to maintain this cheery veneer, and it becomes pretty clear to the country that things are going wrong. So his agony is remarkable. I think he might have had the most painful suffering, mortal suffering of any president in the White House. And he's bearing it very stoically, the pain, these probes, all of these ideas that people keep coming up with to treat him. Garfield is this picture of stoicism for his family, for the nation, for his wife. And he also endures, very interestingly, a lot of the crazy inventions that the people of the country are coming up with. Because again, the binding issue that the doctors were presenting to the nation for a while was we still can't find the bullet in the president. So people start writing in with ideas. One person says, hang him upside down by his ankles. The bullet will fall out. Another comes up with a more intriguing idea, which is to create like a supple probe, like an almost an incomplete electrical circuit, that if they put it into the wound, it'll connect with the metal of the bullet and then light up a light bulb. So that was their idea for another idea. But the most ingenious idea was proposed by Alexander Graham Bell, who had recently invented the telephone. And he was working in DC at the time, and he was intrigued by the idea of finding a bullet in a body, in a piece of organic tissue. So he's working down on Connecticut Avenue here in DC, and he comes up with what is essentially the first metal detector in human history that in his trials works well. And then he gets invited to try it out on the president. And all of a sudden it doesn't work. He later realizes that it's because there are metal springs in the president's bed that are interfering with his machine. But he goes home and he's not allowed to see the president again. He says, I really, I'm pretty disappointed because I think I've done a pretty good work. So that's another, interesting bit of history. The first air conditioner is also put together to try to keep Garfield's sick room cool because it's Washington in summer. So it's like an awful, awful time to be stuck here with no AC. So the first one of those is put together to keep the president, feeling decent. It ends up having to be turned off because it's too loud. But it's this 80 days of just national transfixion on this fallen figure, this period of strange invention and public fascination. It becomes the obsession of the nation, I think probably to the detriment of the person who is suffering at the very center of all of this, who is the president.
Can you speak a bit about how, while the president is essentially dying, I mean, people are hoping that he's going to pull through, but I mean, he is in fact dying. How does government work in those 80 days? Are there concerns about who's running the show now, basically? There
are questions, and people raise that. There were columnists who are saying, who's really running the government? Is it a bunch of unelected bureaucrats now? And so there is this concern initially about how do we show that the person that we still have somebody at the head of state. Not helping that was the idea. These common theories that the Secretary of State, James Blaine, was really running things. And moreover, more disturbingly, the vice president, Chester Arthur, was a stalwart, and so the implications of a stalwart benefiting from a stalwart assassinating the president, need not be elaborated on. But Garfield, the beauty of the way our government ran back then was essentially the business of state was less demanding in those days, and it could run on autopilot. The analogy that I come up with at the time was it's like a speeding bike removed of its rider. It can still go on for a little bit without much active attention. And even there's a piece of writing from Robert Todd Lincoln that I use in the book where each of the secretaries, they missed their president. They couldn't really see him, but they had enough autonomy, and the business of state was not demanding enough where they could still basically run their own departments and there wasn't much to be too worried about. you kind of miss those days, I think. And you might also argue that the president isn't really actively involved in the minutia of government even these days. So it was an interesting case, but it's another interesting case of like a lot of the worries of these days, they have precedent. They were still worrying about a lot of the similar issues back then about like the management of American government and where the responsibility really lies.
One thing that this all conjured up for me, and is that you mentioned this with the stalwart issue, and one thing I always see today is that we have, I feel like conspiracy theories are the new national pastime.
Yeah.
Where, conspiracy theories linger today in the JFK assassination. With basically the assassin in this case seemingly attempting to make a political issue out of the stalwart thing. Why do you think that didn't catch on as much back then? What has changed about our political apparatus and media and just the public's awareness of this stuff? Because you don't really hear a lot of conspiracy theories about the Garfield assassination.
No, you don't. No, that's true. I think there are two major things. First is there was on the ground, at least the initial reaction to the assassination, a lot of evidence that looked like it meant there was a conspiracy. One of the things that the shooter said at the scene was, "I am a stalwart and now Arthur will be president." It's not a good look for Vice President Arthur. And as a matter of fact, as soon as Arthur was taking a boat with his boss, his puppet master, almost Roscoe Conkling, they landed in Manhattan, and then they hear the news, and then they can put two and two together. And so they run to a hotel, and a mob forms outside the hotel and starts sending in notes that says, "We're going to hang Conkling and everybody in there at 5:00 sharp." So the reaction was, not only is there a conspiracy, we're going to go kill the conspirators. That was the immediate reaction of the time. But the key thing in that time, I think one thing was the shooter was demonstrably a mentally unstable person to a profound extent. And as soon as people were piecing together the stories of his background, because his arc was very easy to follow once he had committed this act of infamy. And everybody in this person's life had incredibly negative things to say about him. They all said he was unstable, erratic, mean, evil. It was a pretty thorough portrait of somebody who was bound to cause trouble at some point. And so the reaction after that initial piece of uncertainty was the country was like, this person, there's no chance this person would be involved in a Stalwart conspiracy. Interestingly enough, the country still punished the Stalwarts politically for all of this. They went to the polls, and this was the end of Stalwart power, really, because they blamed the Stalwart office holders for what their rhetoric had inspired somebody to do, which was a very, very interesting point to me, given our lived experiences. And then second, I think another thing that differed back then was the tight and consistent pipelines of information of that time, which were the newspapers. Garfield wrote this interesting column in 1876, and he was writing about a century of Congress. And he wrote about the invention of the telegraph. And he wrote, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but he said, the telegraph will carry to millions of breakfast tables today what was done in Congress yesterday. And he writes of being not sure if that's good in the long run for politicians to actually do their jobs. And I think you could apply that to the circumstances of his assassination, because, when you have limited sources of information and, you had telegraphs, you had newspapers, but without this constant chatter of social media, of the digital age, it leaves less spaces for that to really metastasize in society, conspiracy theories. They did still exist, and there are still certainly voters of that time who did believe to their dying day that Arthur had arranged the assassination of the president. But it was not a very dominant viewpoint, and it was certainly a minority one, and it was not something that the leading authorities of the day gave any credit to for good reason. So it didn't circulate.
Can you tell us what happened to the assassin, about his trial and punishment?
He became this source of public castigation and fascination. And his trial became something that everybody was, that united the country in denunciations of this, horrible person, but that also kept them transfixed on him. So this macabre pairing, he defended himself. He insisted on being his own attorney, and he made full use of that. He, cross-examined witnesses in a violent and, erratic way. And in his representation of himself, that went about as well as you think representations of yourself can go. He didn't, he was found guilty quite quickly. On the hanging, gallows, he pretended to be like a little boy reading pieces of scripture. I'm led to the conclusion that he was a very sick person, but he was also a very genuinely morally broken person. But something that hasn't really been written about that I found was that so Garfield built a political following very carefully from Ohio. He taught generations of kids at this college. He then led some of those kids to war, and then he employed some of them as his political agents. One of those kids who had gone through all those 3 stages of Garfield mentorship was a man named Captain Henry of Galga. That was his name. And he was a follower who had been loyal to Garfield their entire life. And when Garfield became president, he gave a job of Marshal of District of Columbia to this person, to Charles Henry. And so that meant when the assassin was eventually hung, the person who was hanging him was Charles Henry. So this person who had looked up to Garfield as a father figure their entire life got to hang the assassin, which was incredibly poetic, I think.
Yeah, it's a very striking moment in this whole story. And, one thing the book and this story underscores is we often think of assassinations as sort of a singular moment, followed by national mourning. But the Garfield assassination is different because he did survive for so long afterwards. And there was the, ups and downs of, maybe he'll get better.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, can you talk us through like his last moments and how he finally did succumb?
Yes. He was moved eventually to the New Jersey coastline. And part of that justification at the time was that malaria had become a point of real worry in DC. It was the seasonal illness that would crop up every summer and would, be the scourge of people who stayed here over that period of time. And so the idea was to keep Garfield safe from a possible malaria infection. But also moving to the seaside was seen as being this, they still believed almost metaphysically in the restorative power of time on the seaside. So he gets moved there, but it's quite clear to almost everybody in the country that he's about to die. He is on the seashore and he's being tended to by his doctors. His wife and his daughter are there as well. But then one night, he calls over an army friend of his, Almond Rockwell. And he asks Rockwell, do you think my name will have a place in human history? And Rockwell responds by saying, yes, of course, but you must not talk that way. Because, of course, those are the words of somebody who has resigned themselves to asking what they have done and not what they have yet to do. And then Garfield responds to that very interestingly. He goes, no, I think my work is done. And then he dies the next day. He passes away very gently, as I put it in the book, so gently that almost no one watching notices. But again, when you're a biographer and your subject is talking to you every now and then, almost through the fourth wall, when somebody who had devoted their life to work, because he was being described even before his presidency as one of the most accomplished Americans of all time, when somebody who devoted their life to work says, I think my work is done, you kind of have to listen to them. And so I listened to them, and that was how I ended that part of the narrative. I then have a brief epilogue, but that is essentially the end of the book. And then there is this long period of mourning. A disproportionate number of things are named after him. And it's because of both this romance that was created about his life, because he had been last president born in a log cabin, ends up in the White House. He was this American dream story. The circumstances of his assassination, the public reaction to his death, I'd argue, was not unlike the Kennedy assassination, because it was this young, accomplished president struck down before their time and who was remembered in a different way to how he was in his life by a lot of people. They really made a saint out of him. And I think that sowed the seeds for a pretty widespread legacy. There are multiple Mount Garfields in America. There are many Garfield counties. Cities are named after him in some cases. You have Johnny Cash wrote a song about him, interestingly enough. You should look that up. And the cat, the cartoon cat, was named by the cartoonist after a grandfather of his who was named after James Garfield. I was giving a book talk the other day in DC, and a woman comes up to me and says, "I'm named after James Garfield. Why am I named after James Garfield?" And so his name has found a lot of purchase throughout our society. I also encourage listeners and you guys, like, go to Google Maps and type in Garfield Street or Avenue. There's going to be one near you. And it's because of this period of memorial hagiography of this man. And so it's a wonderfully rich life, I think. And it deserves, I think, to be remembered differently. Not as much for its death, because the death is fascinating, but also the incredible life and the complicated politics that he practiced that I think are still relevant today. He's a perfect example of what I'd call what it looks like when a pathologically reasonable person is in command in America, and what policies that produces.
That's so cool. I gotta say, we do have a Garfield Park here in Indianapolis. So that's
there you go. There's only one person that could be named after. Yeah.
I'm curious, you meant, kind of ending the story, as he dies, and then an epilogue. Can you speak to what happened to his family and those closest to him afterward? I imagine like the extreme agony of seeing your loved one get shot and then also suffer in that way for so long. I'm just curious, what were you able to find about them and how their lives went afterwards?
Yeah, it was, there obviously none of them were ever quite the same. I'd start with his mother, because his mother, so Garfield had been raised by a single mother, Eliza Garfield. Her husband had died when he was only 2. As a matter of fact, she had also lost another youngest son. The first James Garfield was her first youngest son, and then he died. And then they named the new kid after the old one, and that became the president. So when he moved into the White House, he took her with him. But tragically, she was also there when she outlived him as well. So she never quite got over that, and she died not long after him. His wife, though, Lucretia Garfield, ended up basically renovating their farm in Menor, Ohio, into what is now today practically the first presidential library. It was the first collection. She dedicated it to the collection of his works, the preservation of his legacy. And she did some remarkable work, and I think a book deserves to be written about her. She was an incredible figure, and possibly more intellectually gifted than he was, just suppressed by the standards of the time. And she sometimes wrote about that. The kids ended up they were remarkable kids, the Garfield children. They became, in one case, kind of a Republican dynasty. The eldest surviving son, Hal, ended up becoming president of Williams College, but then also served as Woodrow Wilson's fuel administrator in World War I. So he became, he served in that cabinet. Jim Garfield, the second eldest son, then became Theodore Roosevelt's Secretary of the Interior. So he then went on and he became one of the Roosevelt's closest confidants. Molly Garfield ended up marrying his assistant, and they had some great kids. Another one of their kids ended up becoming the celebrated architect. Abram Garfield became this very famous architect, and who ended up creating a lot of buildings that have ended up on the National Register of Historic Places. So the kids did great. And I still meet a lot of Garfields every now and then. They're very pleasant people. They're a chip off the old block. The apple has not fallen far from the tree. And I think in many ways they reinforce Ohioan stereotypes. Militantly friendly people. Yeah.
I think I mentioned before that in your introduction, you mentioned that the impact or meaning of legacy, or the legacy of the assassination, tended to overshadow the impact and legacy of his life.
Yeah.
So before we go, I'll ask you a 2-part question. What was the legacy and meaning of his assassination, and what's the legacy of his life?
The legacy of his assassination is multifaceted. First, again, it began the process by which our leaders began to be protected from the American people. It was the end of universal access, pretty much, from regular people like us to our political leaders. We can no longer walk into their office and just ask to see them and get granted that audience. Two, his assassination ended up being really not the birth, but it became the catalyzing moment for the civil service reform era. The first sweeping civil service reform legislation in American history was passed in honor of him, basically, the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act of 1883, and it began to institute competency tests for civil servants in America. It ended up preventing civil servants from being forced to contribute to political campaigns in order to keep their jobs. It excused them from mixing political business with their, private conduct, and not only that, it also instituted norms around their behavior. So it regulated. It began the professionalization of American government, I'd argue, and the yields that has brought to our society are immeasurable, easily in the billions of dollars, in terms of how that has eased the way in which we interact with our public servants. And then I think the legacy of his life, I think there are two, because you have a lot of time to think about these when you're stuck in a room with this person for 5 years. First, in the span of his life, in the divisions that he experienced and the crises that Garfield ended up having to be this broker of solutions over, he ended up, he presided over the first presidential election in American history where the losing side claimed fraud and threatened civil war. That was the election of 1876. He, witnessed Klan violence, economic disaster, racial tension, and difficulty with civil service reform and civil rights legislation. In all of that, and the way he thought about it, and the currents of American society at that time, it's a very good reminder that a lot of the events that we seem to be perceiving today that we call unprecedented are actually not that unprecedented. These things have happened before, or things very much like them, in ways both reassuring and not, because we've been through it all before. And there are two ways you can look at that, in glass half full or glass half empty kind of way. And then the other thing is what I kind of mentioned to you before. He is a very good look at what it looks like, because today we live in a hyper-partisan age, and we often ask ourselves as Americans, wouldn't it be nice if our politicians just got together and did the easy thing? The reason, if they just hashed things out and made deals, and they just, tried to just work out their differences. Garfield's a very good look at what it looks like when somebody is devoted to that. And the legacy is very complicated. It's somebody who is, by trying to please everybody in the room and keep everybody happy, you end up producing very, I'd say, both ideologically and also morally ambiguous outcomes. Because what is compromise if not deferring our most difficult problems to the next generation to solve? And that is not an entirely, that's not an entirely good thing, I'd argue. There's a lot of complexity to that decision. So that's another way in which his life, I think, is still relevant today. And then if you open your Sunday cartoons, you'll see something named Garfield every day that resembles him in absolutely no earthly way. So there's that too.
He didn't like lasagna and hate Mondays.
I don't know if lasagna was a part of the American palate back then. No, but he loved doing work, which distinguishes him from a very lazy feline.
I have to ask, and I almost hate to ask this because it's such a non-historically minded question, but you have spent 5 years hanging out with this person, essentially. And, do you ever give any thought to the question, how might history have turned out differently had he survived? Yeah,
everybody's very interested in that when they think about him. And I think a lot of people read his inaugural address and they think he was, again, like Kennedy, this fallen progressive champion. But also like Kennedy, he was not really that by that part of his life. He was an incrementalist. He was somebody who, as I try to phrase it, he believed that American politics was the art of the possible by that period of his life. And he was very willing to settle for short-term victories and not pursue long-term ones. And that extended from what he tried to do he endorsed universal public education. He endorsed, a thorough cleaning up of civil rights in the South. But really, he did not have those cards. So I think you would have seen somebody who in life would have been a little bit more disappointing than we try to remember him being.
Whenever I enjoy a book as much as I enjoyed this one question I like to ask the writer is, are you working on something new? Is there something we can look forward to in the future?
Yeah, the publisher has asked me for a second one, and I have an idea, but it feels a little bit right now like you cross a marathon finish line and you get immediately asked, "Do you want to ride another marathon?" Yeah, so I think I am going to do it, but I'm gonna need to take a little bit of a breather first and get my feet under me, and then we dive back into it. I can't quite share the subject just yet, but it's not going to be a president. It's going to be 20th century. So we'll be I'm inching towards modernity is what I'd say.
Well, if it in any way involves a murder in some capacity, we'd love to have you back on. We really enjoyed this conversation. And I want to ask you what we ask everybody is just, obviously we had a bit of a different focus on this show than some of the more historical podcasts you've been on. But is there anything that you want the listeners to take away from this conversation? Or is there anything that we didn't ask about that you wanted to emphasize?
What I'd say is I think we're in the midst just nationally of this. I think history is always an evolving subject. That's what a lot of people don't understand. It is not in many ways a static thing, and different perspectives evolve with different eras. And every biographer, every historian, they're always looking at the past in some way through the lens of their own time. And I think we're on the threshold right now of this new version of American history. We're going to start changing the people we want to try to remember. And that extends not only to presidents, but also to regular civic leaders and figures in our past. And I think I like to think that this was a little bit of a part of that, because it's not often that you drag a Gilded Age president out of history and you ask, what did this person do for us? So those are my closing thoughts there.
We'd like to thank C.W. Goodyear for talking with us today. We'd really like to renew our recommendation of his terrific new book, President Garfield, From Radical to Unifier.
We will link to it in our show notes for all you history buffs in our audience.
Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening.